Introduction. This book. Praises be to Allah. We praise Him and seek His help and forgiveness, and take refuge in Him from the evils of ourselves and the ramifications of our bad deeds. Whomever God guides us is truly guided, and those who are misled, no one will ever be able to guide them. And I bear witness that Allah is the one and only God. He has no partners. And I bear witness that our Prophet Muhammad is His servant and messenger. The Breakthrough of the Mind is a book that reviews some of the evidence and signs that prove the existence of the Creator. Be He exalted, and prove that Islam is the truest and perfect religion. The book never claims or aims at compiling every evidence under the sun, and no one can ever accomplish that. It might not even contain new evidence, other than the evidence God embedded in all of us and around us, and shown in His honored book. We don't need new evidence, because God has perfected His religion, as He said, "Prohibited to you are dead animals, blood, the flesh of swine, and that which has been dedicated to other than Allah, and those animals killed by strangling, or by a violent blow, or by a headlong fall, or by goring of horns, and those from which a wild animal has eaten it, except what you are able to slaughter before its death, and those which are sacrificed on stone altars, and prohibited is that you seek decision through divining arrows. That is grave disobedience. This day, those who disbelieve have despaired of defeating your religion. So fear them not, but fear me. This day I have perfected for you your religion, and completed my favor upon you, and have approved for you Islam as religion. But whoever is forced to severe hunger with no inclination to sin, then indeed Allah is forgiving and merciful." Surah Al-Ma'idah. And there is no doubt that the evidence for the presence of the Creator is one of the most important requirements of faith, because it's the foundation upon which the structure of faith is erected. But like the rest of the foundations of faith, it needs to be purified of the impurities which might have accumulated during one's journey for various reasons, and to show the strength of its argument in order to face the newest challenges. The Prophet, peace and praises be upon him, said, "Allah sends to this nation people who revive the faith at the beginning of every 100 years. What's meant by reviving is not inventing new foundations for this faith, or new beliefs, but rather to revive the faith already existing in people's selves, by diagnosing the diseases of this nation and preparing the necessary remedies from within the never-depleting reservoir and the ever-streaming river of the honored book, the Quran, and the pure Hadith. The Breakthrough of a Mind is one of those books that follow the light of the perfect evidence inspired by God to His prophet and messenger, Muhammad, peace and praises be upon him, to remedy and deal with those modern skeptic thoughts around the issue of faith. And certainly it won't be the last book of its kind, as these efforts remain part of God's plan for our existence until God inherits the earth and everything on it. The battle will always continue between the forces of good and evil, and humanity will always continue to question and stir confusion about those deeply rooted, intuitive, and natural knowledge during the entirety of its journey in this life. So those whose hearts are diseased will always find something to cling to in order to justify for themselves why they're incapable of seeing the shining light of the evidence. There are many books specialized in answering the newest heresies, and even answering the Jewish and Christian Orientalists. But we are in shortage of books specialized in answering atheism and irreligiosity. The reason for this is that the root of this evil weed, atheism, was planted in places far away from the Islamic lands, But in our time and age, geographical distances have become obsolete, and most of the barriers and obstacles that separate between the different cultures don't exist anymore. So, it has become our necessary duty to deal with this issue. There is another reason atheism in the previous ages was only a heresy uttered by someone here or there, or at best the beliefs of secluded groups. But it's different today. For example, we have what's known today as New Atheism, which has many advocates and outspoken theorists and philosophers, and will never be satisfied with a silent and peaceful place in one corner of the human thought. But it rather strongly desires to be in the front of the scene, attacking religion and the faith in the Creator, disguised in a cloak of science and philosophy, which requires the vigilant person to view all of their claims so they can be answered in the best possible ways. And God is the best helper. How do I read this book? The book will cover some of the basic and fundamental evidence for the existence of the Creator, be He exalted, and that Islam is the truest religion. Understanding this part of the book is in the capacity of everyone, and they might not even need this book in order to understand this much. But the book will also deal with the arguments of the atheists and the irreligious people against this evidence, and provide the refutations for them. This will require going deep into problematic scientific and philosophical subjects, which might be too complex for some people to grasp. There are people who are fond of scientific subjects and prefer those to philosophical subjects, and other people who prefer philosophy to science. So you might find some satisfaction in learning key words and general definitions without neglecting the whole subject, because that will save a lot of time and effort if you'd like to search deeply into that subject and understand it thoroughly one day. And you might use it to help someone who has questions and doubts by giving them the suitable references for the subjects they need to learn about. Lastly, most of the questions I included in this book are questions I was asked by atheists in one-on-one debates and general discussions on internet websites, or by Muslims who have questions or want to have the necessary knowledge in order to answer these arguments. Ahmed, Ibrahim. Chapter 1. The nature and properties of the evidence for the existence of a Creator. This chapter will discuss the methodology of the evidence that led to the belief in a Creator, and not the evidence themselves in detail, because this part must be clarified first before getting into a debate with agnostics or atheists or those sophists who just deny everything. Without a clear method and basic principles agreed upon between the two parties, any such debate will be fruitless. The noble Quran depicts the stubbornness of those people who refused to believe the messengers in the past. When they demanded specific proofs and said that they would never believe unless their prophets brought forth those specific proofs, just to deny everything afterwards and continue to disbelieve, even after the prophet showed them the proofs they asked for. Just as Pharaoh said, "Then why have there not been placed upon him bracelets of gold, or come with him the angels in conjunction?" Surah Az-Zukhruf 53. Instead of looking at the evidences the prophet Moses, peace be upon him, had shown him, the Egyptian Pharaoh turned away from them and asked for another evidence, claiming that the proofs he now wanted would satisfactorily prove to him that Moses is a prophet, and that if Moses made this happen, he would only then follow him. Thus was always what disbelievers used to say to the messengers, that if they were real prophets, then they must be able to bring their dead ancestors back to life. And when our verses are recited to them as clear evidences, their argument is only that they say, "Bring back our forefathers, if you should be truthful." Surah Al-Jathiyah 25. The same way the polytheists of Quraysh said to Prophet Muhammad, peace and praises upon him, that they won't believe him unless he breaks open a spring for them from the ground, and so on and so forth, endlessly arguing and asking for more evidence, which only led them to more denial and stubbornness. And they say, "We will not believe you until you break open for us from the ground a spring, or until you have a garden of palm trees and grapes that make rivers gush forth within them in force and abundance, or make the heaven fall upon us in fragments as you have claimed, or bring Allah and the angels before us, or you have a house of gold, or you ascend into the sky, and even then we will not believe in your ascension until you bring down to us a book we may read. Say, exalted is my Lord. Was I ever but a human messenger? Surah Al-Isra 90-93. This avoidance of rational discussion of the evidence by demanding different proofs other than the ones their prophets brought stabs at the very methodological structure of the evidence, meaning that this denial gives the impression or illusion that the proofs the prophets, peace be upon them, brought forward to their people at the beginning of their invitation to God were not enough for one to open their eyes to knowledge and certainty, as if those proofs were only probabilities, mental suggestions, or maybe even fallacies. Disbelievers often argued that only when the prophets show them the proofs they suggest, then and only then they will believe in God's messages. And today, those who choose to disbelieve in a creator practice these same old ways in their attempts to disprove the evidence for belief as based on incomplete knowledge, or that it contains flaws or fallacies, or that they don't really serve the purpose they are supposed to be serving. Then, instead of honestly and carefully analyzing the proofs in detail, they deny the whole thing, saying that the method is wrong, and then they propose the right method by which a proof should be judged as sound and true. They, for example, say that only experimental evidence can be the way to know any truth, and since we can't experimentally verify the existence of a creator, then it can't be a truth. And consequently, any proofs that the disbelievers in a creator present are of no value and are not worthy of a serious discussion. An atheist or an agnostic then says to you, bring me an experimental proof that a creator exists, or just forget it. But is the experimental method really the only way to acquiring knowledge? And is this approach able to explain all kinds of truth? This is what we will be discussing shortly. There are also those who say, why should all the proofs for the existence of a creator be inferential? If Allah wants us to believe in Him, why doesn't He end all of this confusion and just let us see Him? Isn't a direct sensory evidence the strongest and most appropriate evidence for a fateful matter like this? There are also those whose exaggerations leads them to sophistry, eventually losing any kind of certainty in everything. For those people, neither experimental sciences nor direct evidence of the senses can be satisfactory, and they are not even able to know whether this world really exists or if it's an illusion in their heads, because to them, there is no way to be certain of anything, and anyone who seeks certainty is asking for an illusion or an impossibility, at least from their point of view. There are also those who claim that there are no real evidence in the case of believing in a creator, and that it is at best not more than guesswork and filling gaps in our limited knowledge. All of those people refuse the method and the accuracy of the evidence supporting a belief in the Creator, without discussing the evidence directly or in detail. How to answer those people? How strong is the evidence for belief really? This and more is what will be discussed in this chapter, Allah willing. Is the belief in the Creator associated with the basis of all sciences and axioms? It is of Allah's grace that He doesn't burden anyone beyond their capacity. And since every sane person is invited to believe, then it must be within their capacity to verify the truths of a belief system for themselves, no matter how simple-minded they are or what kind of education they received. He, be He glorified and exalted, is the most generous, the most patient. For this reason, He made those truths simple and instinctive, self-evident, and a basis to any knowledge out there, such as the casualty principle, which will be explained shortly. The principles upon which humankind have built all of our knowledge and sciences are themselves evidence for the existence of a creator, before being evidence to anything else. A human being is unable to know anything in the world unless this knowledge is based upon those basic principles, which are themselves evidence for belief. This puts every skeptic in the evidences of belief between two choices. Number one, either they deny all the knowledge they gained during their lives in order to deny the evidence for belief, and in this case they won't be able to claim that their opinion about the issue of belief has any value. Number two, or they accept those basics when it comes to sciences only to reject them when they debate the issue of belief in the Creator, Thus, they reveal their self-contradiction, pride, ingratitude, and stubbornness. And this shows how strong the argument for the evidence of belief is, and the solid connection between this evidence and the basic principles on which all science is based upon. In fact, the deeper the knowledge of mankind and their awareness of themselves and their place in the universe, the stronger the evidence for belief in a creator. This is exactly the opposite of what irreligious people claim, that belief is based upon primitive perceptions, and that religious concepts are continually fading away as human knowledge and awareness are progressing. But the truth is exactly the opposite, because each new knowledge humanity acquires should be a reminder of the basics upon which this knowledge is built. And these basics are what verify all knowledge, as there is nothing we humans know that is not based upon the principle of causality. And if causality is a major proof that a single creator exists, and it represents the basis of all science and certainties, then what knowledge do we have that's more strongly proven than the knowledge that a creator exists? Certainly none. This might be, and Allah knows best, what Moses, peace be upon him, alluded to as he spoke to the Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, "And what is the Lord of the worlds?" Moses said, "Lord of the heavens and the earth and all that is in between them, if you seek to be convinced with certainty." Surah Ash-Shu'ara 23-24. Meaning, if you're really certain of anything, you must first be certain of Allah's existence and His divinity. The explanation of Fathul Qadir, a Quranic interpretation, says if you are certain means if you are certain of anything in life, then you should be certain of this first. Another Quranic interpretation, Al-Kashf, says if you are ever certain of anything, then this, the existence of a creator, should be the first certain knowledge, because of its clarity and shining truth. Al-Tabari, a third Quranic interpretation, says, if you are certain, Moses says, if you are certain that what you are perceiving or experiencing around you truly exists, then you must also be certain that Allah is the Lord of the heavens and the earth and everything between them. So, you who claims to know anything, on what basis do you claim you do know it? Was it something other than the principle of causality? Causality is, first and foremost, a proof of the existence of a creator. That is why believing in the creator is the first certainty and the basis of all certainties. And there is another great benefit in observing the inseparability of, the correlation between, the evidence of a creator and the things you consider certain in life. And that is your own independence to know this truth, whilst not needing other people to verify it for you. You will not feel inferior to those intelligent, knowledgeable people who choose to disbelieve, because even if these people's own intelligence and knowledge help them gain knowledge in ways you can't, their knowledge doesn't help them see the forest for the trees, for the simple reason that a basic principle can't be negated by a branch of knowledge. Basic principles are the foundations of every knowledge and science, and everything else is equal in front of this truth, unless someone claims that their branch of knowledge allow them to discover that the evidence for belief in a creator is not in accordance with the basic principles which we all approve of. Then this is a different issue. The statement, "the whole is bigger than its individual parts," is an axiom known by all people, whether they're simple-minded or extremely intelligent. And it's a truth that a simple-minded person doesn't require the approval of this intelligent individual in order for them to believe it. They are simply certain of it without the need of anyone else's opinion. This, in and of itself, ensures the survival of everyone from a great affliction, namely the following of other opinions without verification for oneself. This is a fallacy known as appeal to authority, where as soon as this or that great scientist or great wise person says something, it soon becomes a solid and non-negotiable truth for some people, who unfortunately disable their faculties of reasoning, even though they don't really have a single proof for what that person is saying. And instead of verifying the truth for themselves and finding the evidence that led and urged this scientist or wise person to make their claims, the exact opposite happens. They blindly believe whatever that authority is stating to be a truth, and the case is closed. Where those statements become final instead of being a starting point to learn, just because someone they respect and revere had said it. And that is why those people won't have an excuse to present to God on Judgment Day. As Allah says, "The day their faces will be turned about in the fire, they will say, 'How we wish we had obeyed Allah and obeyed the Messenger.' And they will say, 'Our Lord, indeed, we obeyed our masters and our dignitaries, and they led us astray from the right way." Surah Al-Ahzab, 66 through 67. The difference between natural disposition or intuition and primitive perception of things. Intuition, or al-fitra, resembles a shining dot at the center of the heart of every human being that God created, and it guides each one of us throughout their life journey. This dot contains all goodness and is highly repulsive towards evil, and this shows clearly in the innocence of children. Prophet Muhammad, peace and praises be upon him, said, "No child is born except upon the natural disposition, al-fitra." Within this shining dot, there are imprinted basic guidelines which constantly work on straightening and correcting one's understanding and enable each person to understand, gain knowledge, and be creative. There are also within this dot intuitive truths that a person can successfully use with ease without having to exert any effort to prove them. It becomes the foundation upon which a person bases their life, day after day, during their life journey. And without doubt, there are those who go astray and build their lives upon wrong foundations. And there are those who build it on straight and strong foundations. For this reason, and because that dot is the point of beginning, and because it is the deepest place within ourselves, when a non-believer repents and chooses Islam, they feel a great comfort, like a traveler who has been traveling for a long time and finally comes back home. It is also for the same reason that all people, including atheists and those who worship other gods, resort to God alone and forget everything else when they face adversity. Because when someone is in a time of great distress and fear, they will most likely reach for the most deeply rooted truths within themselves and find this deep shining spot within themselves to cling to. To this effect, Allah says, "And when adversity touches you at sea, lost are all those you invoke except for Him. But when He delivers you to the land, you turn away from Him. And ever is man ungrateful." Surah Al-Ezra, 67. And He also says, "And when affliction touches man, he calls upon us, whether lying on his side or sitting or standing. But when we remove from him his affliction, he continues in disobedience, as if he had never called upon us to remove an affliction that touched him. Thus is made pleasing to the transgressors that which they have been doing." Surah Yunus, 12. He also said, "And when adversity touches man, he calls upon his Lord, turning to Him alone. Then when He bestows on him a favor from Himself, he forgets Him whom he called upon before, and he attributes to Allah partners to mislead people from His way. Say, enjoy your disbelief for a little. Indeed, you are of the companions of the fire." Surah Az-Zumar, 8. But there is a very dangerous notion, which is to confuse intuition or instinct with primitive perceptions. The existence of intuition in a human being since birth equips them with the ability to identify the truth, and the ability to accept it and to cherish it. This applies to all walks of life, especially when it comes to knowing God and true religion. But intuition alone doesn't allow a person to know everything, and it doesn't make them immune from forming, because of various factors, wrong perceptions about themselves and about the universe around them. That is why God, be He blessed and glorified, clarifies that a human being is born without any knowledge whatsoever, but He still bestows on them the tools necessary to gain knowledge, the faculties of hearing and seeing, senses to experiment and directly observe phenomena, and intellect, mental and analytical tools to understand and explain those phenomena and know the difference between things and the correlation between them. As Allah says, "And Allah has extracted you from the wombs of your mothers, not knowing a thing, and He made for you hearing and vision and intellect that perhaps you would be grateful." Surah Al-Nahl, 78. Primitive perceptions about things should never be considered intuitive or instinctive, because that might indicate that those perceptions are truths that we were taught by God through intuition, and this is certainly not the case. When a primitive person is proven wrong by science, those who think that those perceptions are the same as intuition would mistrust intuition as an honest guide to the truth. And this is precisely what atheists exploit in their claim that religion is a primitive perception which science will completely defeat one day. For example, when a person looks up at the sun and moon and finds them in constant motion, then looks at the earth and finds it standing still, they would initially think that the sun and moon are rotating around the earth. But we know now that is false, and that this was a primitive notion that's no longer held. And if you ask a blind person about this matter, they would be able to tell you, even though the blind person is in possession of the same intuitive capability that a person with sound sight possesses. The same thing applies to the way we perceive colors. We look around and we see green, yellow, and red items, and we think that those colors are innate qualities of them, while in truth those items have absorbed the rest of the wavelengths from the white light, reflecting only the wavelength for the color that we see. Similarly, black items are black because they absorb all the light and don't reflect any colors. However, if you ask a blind person about the color of things, they won't know the answer. This all shows us that these are only primitive perceptions about things, which have nothing to do with intuition. The same thing can also be applied to the perception of time, the nature of matter and waves, and many other things that science completely changed our perception about. Many people refused these scientific prepositions at first because they thought they were contradicting what they naturally know. On the other hand, many others refused all talk about intuition on the basis that science proved the wrongness of our primitive thoughts. However, both sides are wrong. Why don't we see God directly, or the evidence of His existence direct? If we require direct evidence of God instead of inferential and intellectual evidence of His existence, then there won't be any meaning or need for things like the mind, free will, or choice, and there wouldn't be room for testing the human being, who God has distinguished from all other creatures by entrusting them with the most precious gift, the mind, and made this world a test for them. Most living beings, specifically animals and humans, including the mentally healthy and mentally incompetent ones, are able to perceive things. But only the mentally sound person is capable of inferential reasoning to connect between things and events which might not be experienced together. And since the objective of any test is to show the distinction between the examinees and not what they are all equally capable of doing, then inferential evidence is the most appropriate form of testing humankind, because it targets the intellect, the only quality that distinguishes humans from animals. And that is the reason why in Islam, only sane people are held responsible for knowing God, be He glorified and exalted, and insane people are excused because they are not in possession of the tool that enables them to know God. Inferential reasoning is a scientific method used by all sciences. For example, even though we've never really seen gravity or subatomic particles, we know that they exist and know what characteristics they have by observing their indirect effects. This is inferential reasoning as used in science. This answers those who argue that true and conclusive evidence can only be the one that we test through our direct senses, and who regard inferential evidence as insufficient for true knowledge and certainty, answering the claim that there can be no certainty. There are those who claim that certainty can never be attained, and that we cannot be certain of anything because the foundations upon which one builds their knowledge, namely scientific theories, constantly change, and that the conclusions our minds draw from our experiences cannot always be trusted. Such things can be heard from a teenager who happened to hear some scientific and philosophical terms of which they don't really have a deep or sufficient knowledge about. Then you hear them parroting to you that truth is relative, because of Einstein's theory of relativity. This is completely untrue, because the theory has nothing whatsoever to do with the truth being relative or not. And anyone who does that shows that they don't know anything about Einstein's theory except its name. They might have also heard about Karl Popper's scientific principle of falsifiability, which states that the scientific method is central to skepticism, and that scientific theories cannot be 100% verified by any possible accumulation of observational evidence. They can be provisionally accepted if they survive serious attempts to falsify them. But at the same time, they can never be established conclusively. Such phrases could lead one to a generalized state of doubt about everything under the sun, But the truth of the matter is not so, as all those statements do not mean that we don't have evidence for our current knowledge, but the objective is that we should never fall into the trap of inductive generalization fallacy. If all the swans we see in Europe are white, then we can't say that there can't be other colors for swans, because there could be black swans in Australia. Similarly, the evidence that could disprove something that we believe is true shouldn't be refused, because if such refuting evidence is true, it has a stronger position than the supportive evidence. This is undoubtedly true, but it doesn't lead to the exaggerated conclusion of those who say that there can be no certainty. I'll use an example that combines all the previous ideas so that it can be clear to the reader the path of those who are lost in their reasoning and the path which rational people should take. For example, the classic Galilean relativity invariance is a principle that we can all experience when we deal with conventional velocity. For as we all know, if we travel at a speed of 100 kilometers per hour and another object travels beside us in the same direction at a speed of 200 kilometers per hour, we will see it traveling at our own speed, 100 kilometers per hour. But if the object travels in the opposite direction, we see it traveling at a speed of 300 kilometers per hour. What happens here is that speed differs from the different motion of the observer. But if we deal with great speed approaching the speed of light, 0.8, 0.9, and 0.99 of the speed of light, we will start to feel that there is a mistake in the detection of speed, and that something went wrong, such that if we start to deal with the speed of light, we get into a really strange dilemma. That is, the speed of light is always constant. As if we travel at such great speed and a beam of light passes behind us, we will see it traveling at the normal speed of light, similar to what we measure if we stood still on the ground. The same thing will happen if it traveled in the opposite direction. This observation is one that refuted the Galilean relativity which we saw, and still see it as very accurate in our daily experiences. This shows us that the concepts and principles which we thought apply to all cases are actually only true within specific conditions and limitations. We then sought a different approach to describe the relationships of time, space, and motion, namely the relativity theory of Einstein, who, looking for an appropriate solution to this dilemma, has found that time dilates and that length contracts whenever speed approaches the speed of light, because time is not constant as we used to think, but rather it is the speed of light that is constant. So, the theory of relativity doesn't really say that everything is relative, but rather states that the speed of light is constant, and not time or space as we used to think. Consequently, there is no such thing as an absolute frame reference, as Newtonian mechanics used to describe the cosmos as a huge theater stage over which all events are taking place. Therefore, the relativity theory replaced those old paradigms. But it didn't state that there are no certainties, as some people might deduce from its name. That scientific theories can be refuted and replaced by other new ones after presenting supportive evidence, this is what the philosophy of science achieves by means of the falsification principle, and they don't mean that there can never be true evidence for anything in this world. But if we put aside this teen talk and begin to investigate the philosopher's sayings, we will find that some philosophers did indeed, and still do, carry the flag of skepticism, both in the old world and modern times. And you could notice that even though some scientists quote such ideas in their popular books or TV interviews, they won't apply them to their serious peer-reviewed research or academic books, because these exaggerations have nothing to do with science or intellect in reality, as I will show you now, God willing. The agnostic, when they resort to their most protective corner. The agnostic always thinks that they have a protective corner they can resort to whenever they feel that they are bombarded by arguments, and that is to dig themselves in more and more skepticism, thinking that they can go on questioning everything endlessly, including logical facts or mental faculties and our perception of reality. But the truth of the matter is not anything like what the agnostic thinks. Let's assume the following conversation between a believer, let's call him Amir, and an agnostic named Zayed, and that, for example, Amir's argument is now the imperative fact that two opposite things cannot exist at the same time and place. The agnostic will then resort to their best protective corner and start questioning this fact in order to escape from the idea of faith and its shackling responsibilities that begin to appear on the horizon. Zayed, how do we know that logical axioms are true? Amir, excuse me, do you mean that a thing can be itself and its exact opposite at the same time? What does that even mean? Zayed, this means that there is a possibility that a thing can have a property and its exact opposite in certain conditions, or some other universe perhaps, or Amir. Wait a minute, my agnostic friend. I didn't mean that with my question, but I meant that you have just unintentionally employed the same principle that you're trying to refute. Zayed, how so? Amir, because when you try to question the impossibility of the union of two opposite things, you begin by the assumption that there is a contradiction between thinking that two opposites can exist together, and that two things cannot exist together, and that if one of these two propositions is true, the other is not true, and consequently, these two propositions can't exist together. What is happening here is that you aren't able to go on with skepticism indefinitely as you might think, because in the end you will find yourself appealing to the very logic that you're trying to refute. This happens because these facts are the very cognitive content and the very truth that we're trying to discover with our minds, as they are related to existence itself, independent of our minds. And this is why they stay resistant whenever we try to manipulate them, because without these facts, there is no existence, no meaning, no knowledge, and no truth. These facts are not a part of our knowledge. They are knowledge itself. They are the truth itself. And this puts an agnostic in a situation where they have to choose between two things. Either their mind stops doing its job, that is, acquiring knowledge, or they admit to the fact that there is an independent truth whose origins and fundamentals are deeply rooted in the mind, in the form of intuitive truths, so the mind can't proceed a single step unless it finds a possible path, even if this step is toward skepticism, because there is no functioning, no proceeding forward unless there is a path. Zayed, all so-called facts could be wrong, because there is no way we can be sure about them except by using our minds, and our minds are themselves forced to employ the same logic that we are trying to verify. We are forced to use our minds, even though we don't know whether they are the right means to obtain knowledge or not. Therefore, we can't be certain of anything, and we should maintain our skepticism and question everything. Amir, it isn't like that. But you didn't pay attention to something very important. That is, if we choose to say that these logical facts are true or false, or even if we say that we don't know whether they're true or not, all of those choices lead to the same conclusion, that these facts are true, because of the existence of different choices. If we choose one, we can't choose the other. This means that we're still employing the same logical fact, that two opposites can unite. This rule is the very meaning of knowledge, and it's an independent meaning, not an invention of the mind, but it's rather already there, and the mind only discovers it. Just like using our senses to discover things around us, there are people who say that what we are detecting with our senses could be wrong. This is possible, but anyone who refuses to use the senses themselves to discover their surroundings doesn't have the right to invent another way. You either use your eyes to look at things, or you just close them. But to use your eyes to hear, or to not see what you're actually seeing, is complete nonsense. The same thing happens with using the mind to discover and infer meanings that might or might not describe reality. What you're trying to do, for example, is using the mind to doubt simple logic axioms, by way of doubting the mind itself. And yet you did that by using the mind and these logical axioms themselves as a basis for this skepticism. So you either use the mind to observe and deduce obvious logical axioms, or not use it at all. But you can't use it to question logical axioms. And the conclusion is therefore one of these things. Number one, I use my mind and the logical axioms are true. Number two, I don't use my mind at all. But it can never be, I use my mind and I trust nothing that my mind tells me, or that the logical axioms are doubtful. Whomever wants to refuse all of these options, because again, they are inferences of the mind, they must understand that this doesn't mean that they discovered that logic is wrong, because all they did in this case is that they stopped discovering logic. No more, no less. Zayed, look, Amir, just pick any logical conclusion, however highly certain it is, then tell me, how do you know that this conclusion is true? Amir, Because its premises are correct. Zayed. And how do you know that its premises are correct? Amir. By using my mind. Zayed. And how do you know that your mind is an appropriate tool to make correct judgments? Suppose that your mind has a defect of some kind. It would be impossible for you to know that it has a defect, and so the correct conclusion is that everything the mind judges is questionable, no matter how certain you think it is. Can you tell me where the fallacy in this conclusion is? Amir. The fallacy is that you think you can build a logical argument to conclude that logical axioms are wrong. And this is impossible, because to say that they are wrong is to admit that there can be wrong things in opposition to right and true things. Therefore, there must be an essence that things possess, and there must be opposites to them. And this conclusion means that there are facts, that there are logical axioms, but you took this conclusion and gave it another name, a useless name, that these facts are not true. It's as if you're making the conclusion that you exist because you're thinking, but then you call this existence absence, as if you're saying, I'm absent because I'm thinking. You can't escape logical consistency, but you can take a conclusion, existence, and change its name, absence. This is the same as concluding that logical axioms are wrong because there are no right or wrong things, in spite of this being an evidence for the existence of right and wrong. Just like concluding that the process of thinking is evidence for the absence of a thinking being, even though it is evidence for the opposite, for the existence of a thinking being. So, doubting logical axioms is a conclusion that can itself be a premise for another inference. That is, there is a difference between the truth, which we just concluded in the example of the existence of a thinking being, and between falsehood, which we have deceived our minds with before. Therefore, your conclusion is not the end of the road as it might seem at first glance, but rather it leads to other necessary conclusions, as you can't use your mind to question logical axioms, but you can stop using your mind altogether, which is equally impossible. Which means that an axiom, an obvious logical fact, is the starting point in any knowledge we acquire, while skepticism isn't the starting, nor is it the ending point of any knowledge we acquire, nor is it abstract non-knowledge that isn't founded on a previous logical structure. But skepticism is, rather, a cognitive product of previous axioms, which enable you to think that there might be other possibilities other than what we think as absolute truths. And despite the simplicity of this statement, it can only be based on intuitive abilities to distinguish between right and wrong, as opposites that can never be combined. The mix-up in your proposition happens when you change the definitions, putting skepticism as a beginning point to acquire any knowledge, justifying that by thinking that skepticism means total ignorance, which isn't based on any previous knowledge. Then you go on and think of axioms as the end product of knowledge, which requires prior skepticism in order to get that conclusion or axiom. So switching names and places is the root of the problem you have. But to base this conclusion of yours on the imperfection of our minds and knowledge, or that we don't have evidence to prove that what our minds interpret for us is true, is irrational. Because even though all the knowledge that we ever have is dependent of the interpretations of our minds, that doesn't mean you can question basic logical axioms, because you'll need to prove the truth of axioms first in order for you to doubt them, as I just explained. And if you do this, you would abandon logical axioms and the process of thinking altogether. But even in the midst of this abandonment, there would still be one piece of information that you can't doubt, and that is you are an imperfect and ignorant being, and that there is a great chance for you to be deceived. This information can lead us to other conclusions and evidence for the existence of a creator, through the evidence of casualty. Zayed. So, you want to say that since we can't but believe what our minds are telling us about logical axioms, then we must accept it because we have no other solution. Amir. No, I didn't say that. But I said that skepticism itself can be an illogical and self-contradicting mental game. And this means that it is invalid, and that logical axioms are true, and can't be logically disproved, not because our minds are the only means we have, and that the mind is programmed to use these logical axioms, but rather because knowledge itself is comprised of those axioms. as you can't begin by assuming that they are wrong, then build a different cognitive structure, even if it's a very simple one, or if it's one simple statement that says that logical axioms are questionable. Zayed. But I still think that if we don't have any other means to gain knowledge except our minds, and therefore we cannot evaluate our own minds, then everything we know must be questionable. And there is no other method with which we can escape this situation, because everything that was said about the mind can be said of any other method. I don't know. Maybe there is no way out of this dilemma, except for each one of us to be a god unto themselves, inherently knowledgeable of all things without reasons or causes. Amir, the way out of this state is to discover the fallacy. Where is the fallacy? The fallacy is that you are using the same logical axioms that you are trying to refute, and this means that you are not doubting everything as you are trying to convince yourself. And you haven't found a shred of evidence to doubt the logical axioms as you think. And you can't use the fact that you don't know everything as a basis to think that there might be something out there, which if we find, will give us reason to question simple logical axioms, as you are deluding yourself. Why am I saying that you're deluding yourself? Because you can't use axioms as a starting point to arrive to doubt. And you can't doubt anything unless you use these very axioms. For example, if I use Aladdin's magical lamp to prove that Aladdin's magical lamp is a myth that doesn't exist, I would then be doing something very ridiculous. Because if I use the lamp, then it does exist. And if I proved that it doesn't exist, then I could never have used the lamp. The same thing applies to logical and mathematical proof. You begin with a proposition. And if by using the correct sequence you arrive at the conclusion that the proposition is incorrect, in fact it's just the opposite of what the proposition states, then this is a proof that the proposition is incorrect. You can't combine between the wrong proposition, the contradicting result, and the correct sequence unless you give each one the wrong name. And this is fallacious. Disposing of logical axioms by naming them wrong is meaningless in this case. Zayed, why couldn't it be that our minds are convincing us with all of these things? They could be convincing us with things like the impossibility of the coexistence of two contradictions, or that if something is true, then it can't be false. And if it is false, then it can't be true. Why couldn't it be true and false at the same time? Or maybe a truth isn't as it seems. Maybe what we deem as the truth is falsehood, and the falsehood is truth. Amir, once again, all you did now is give things different names, and you use the same axioms that you're trying to refute, because you yourself consider what you're saying is true, or at least possibly true. And if what you're saying is true, then it can't be false. And if what you're saying can't be true and false at the same time, then this logical axiom is true, even if you give it a different name. Therefore, your skepticism can't be true unless if there is a possibility that it's false, or if skepticism to you can at the same time mean the impossibility of skepticism. How so? Because it would be meaningless to be skeptic about something unless there is a meaning for what is true and what is false. Therefore, logical axioms can't be subject to skepticism, unless you get into a logical paradox that impairs the very evidence that skepticism is trying to provide to prove that something is untrue. Zayed, okay, this is all fine. We won't question logical axioms, but what about the possibility that our minds deceived us by letting us perceive what seem to be very solid and integral facts that we think we can't question? But then if they were seen from a different perspective, a different dimension outside of our minds, we would discover that they are only mental tricks, and that there are no concepts of right and wrong. And we wouldn't even know how these concepts will look like, because there would be a totally different perspective that has nothing to do with our senses, or what we deem as facts, or anything in the world as we know it. Let's call this reality B, for example. Amir, and this possibility you just proposed of a reality B, will everything in this reality B be true and in harmony within it, or not? If your answer is yes, then reality B will have many similarities with our current reality, because things like truth and harmony are the logic of our current reality. If they describe the reality you proposed and apply to it, then it is based on logical axioms. And since our reality bears such similarities to reality B, then reality B has the same logical axioms we know. And if your answer is no, then this proposal is just a meaningless thought, and it's only another fallacious attempt to escape reality. All you did was that you created an illusion and just called it reality B. Therefore, this leads us to these conclusions. Number 1, you can't doubt logical axioms because they are constant and self-evident. Number 2, you can't depend on the deficiency of the mind or the possibility of self-deception in order to hypothesize a different logical reality that invalidates ours. Zayed: this is all great, but it's only according to the standards of our minds, and we can't be certain that this standard is true. Amir: if we are deceived, and we somehow manage to find a way to see ourselves and our current reality from inside reality B, will we be able to see those inside this current reality as deceived or no? If your answer is yes, then this means that the people who inhabit this parallel reality that functions according to reality B are employing the principle of casualty, just like we do. Because deception means that you weren't able, for some reason, to obtain the correct knowledge, or that you weren't able to join reality B. And if the principle of casualty exists in their reality, then they will have the same logical principles as ours. If your answer is no, then the argument is over, and everything we see here in this world is true, and we won't experience anything different if we join reality B. What I wanted to clarify is that there is no logical possibility that invalidates our existent logical principles. And the imperfection of our knowledge doesn't mean that all the logical principles are wrong, or that if we have perfect knowledge, we'd be able to see that those logical principles are wrong. And even though these possibilities could seem plausible at first glance, that since we aren't capable of knowing everything, then there is a possibility that everything we know might be untrue, or that we might be deceiving ourselves. However, if you look closely, you will find that our logical principles must be true, and that they are so deep that they represent the essence of knowledge itself, where we either know them or we don't know anything at all. But we can't know that these principles are wrong or a deception. In the end, religion doesn't request from you certainty of the kind that makes you perfectly knowledgeable of everything. Rather, it asks of you the kind of certain knowledge that fits you as an imperfect being. This kind of certainty that is provided by the logical and self-evident principles that humans base all their knowledge and sciences on. And because they are self-evident, you can't doubt them. If you think you know anything in life, even if it is your knowledge that there is a possibility that logical principles are wrong and that our minds could be deceiving us, then by default, you know that self-evident logical axioms are true. And these self-evident logical axioms are evidence for belief in a creator, before they can be evidence for anything else. Allah said, "Lord of the heavens and the earth and that between them, if you would be certain." Surah Ad-Dukhan 7. The previous discussion was regarding the agnostic who questions logical axioms and basic thought principles. But what about the agnostic who accepts these principles as basic components of the universe that originated one way or another, but they question our interpretations for everything around us, standing midway between logical axioms and their necessary results? With this agnostic that suffers a state of loss and denial of their mental faculties, we can reach the first step towards certainty. And the first step towards certainty in this case, which cannot be refuted by these delusions and mental puzzles and mazes, is asking them this question: do you consider yourself an ignorant who lacks knowledge, or not? If their answer is a certain no, then they are cured from this sophistry, even though their answer itself is incorrect, since in reality we're actually knowledge-deficient individuals. And if their answer is yes, then by simply acknowledging that they know something without any doubt, they are also cured from this state of mind. But they still need to invest in this information to reach with it achieved certainty, which can be achieved by employing the principle of casualty, that is, the logical inference that since they acknowledge that they don't know and can't know everything, then they are not perfect. And since they can see that they are not perfect, and that no other beings who share this world with them is perfect, then there is perfection somewhere, a perfect being, because a being like them and us, who are inherently imperfect and who need certain conditions to exist, cannot be imagined to exist until after those conditions are met, and consequently, this being is superseded by something. A being who is superseded by something is one who is being acted upon, so there must be some force that is acting on them. So if they doubt all their inductive knowledge on the basis that it's imperfect, there is, however, a perfect piece of information that they have, namely that they're ignorant and imperfect, which should be enough for them to be certain of the existence of a creator, if they follow the right way to deduce knowledge from then on. For this reason, we always repeat that the evidence for a belief in God is associated with the basis of all sciences and intuitive truths. And here I'm reminded with a practical example of this idea, which is a quote from the atheist physicist Stephen Hawking in his book, The Grand Design. As he said, exaggerating a bit on his agnosticism, "Might not we ourselves also be inside some big goldfish bowl and have our vision distorted by an enormous lens? So we say to him, so be it. Let whomever you think put you in this big bowl deceive you as they wish. Keep doubting all your knowledge that you have based on these illusions. But doubting all you can never doubt that you are an ignorant being who always needs to learn more. And this you can't do except through observation and reasoning. Isn't this right? This truth you cannot doubt, because if you already know everything, and if you don't need to learn in order to know about yourself, there wouldn't have been room for doubt within yourself, and there wouldn't have been room to deceive you. And ignorance wouldn't have been a possibility for you at any moment. And, since you know everything, everything will be a certainty to you. Knowledge will be an inherent quality in yourself, not something that you acquire, since your very existence cannot be imagined without this complete knowledge. So now you have the following. Number 1, certain knowledge that you are an imperfect being, who needs certain conditions to exist. Number 2, certain knowledge that an imperfect thing or being is in need of a cause that made these conditions and the existence and sustenance of this being possible. Number 3, certain knowledge that anything that needs something is inherently imperfect. These natural conclusions are what constitute the evidence of causality, which leads you to the proof that a creator exists. Here, Hawking can be certain that a creator exists, while at the same time entertaining his doubts about everything else that his senses convey to him about his sense of self and the outside world. Does the experimental scientific method support atheism? Or is the inadequacy of the experimental method to explain all kinds of facts is what makes the views of atheism more appealing? Truth is, a scientific theory draws a picture of a certain phenomenon, and that picture contains facts, observations, and hypotheses. So without a doubt, it has a mental, inferential aspect to it. But that is only true if we are dealing with physical entities, meaning that this approach had doubtlessly proved its success when applying it to a physical phenomena. But what if we are dealing with conceptual things, or abstract values, such as a creative design, or a purpose, or a drawing, or the meaning of literature works, or anything within the domain of humanities, or even when dealing with logical and mathematical subjects? In any of these cases, we would be in a real dilemma when we try to verify them using an experimental method. This shows that the wonderful success of scientific experimental methods in dealing with concrete material things is not the only way to discover truths. And it's certainly not the perfect approach to deal with everything in life. If, for example, I ask you if you could present an empirical evidence to prove that the Mona Lisa painting is better than the random, colorful drawings that your little child draws on the house walls, the answer will be no. And this inability to provide evidence is not a result of the absence of truths that experimental science cannot deal with. Because this can be true when it comes to comparing the works of an artist like Michelangelo and Da Vinci, for example, because this is subject to personal taste, which is relative. But if the comparison is between something we all can see as ugly, example, a pile of waste, and between what we are capable of judging as beautiful, an example, a lush tree or a butterfly, here is a truth that we can all acknowledge. but are incapable of dealing with it using a purely materialistic experimental method, because the method is really inadequate for dealing with this kind of abstract truths, since we are not testable. We all know for certain the difference between the random drawings of a little boy and the Mona Lisa. But materialist experimental science doesn't see the difference. To it, they are both equal, as long as the quantity of colors and the colored areas match. Empirical testability distinguishes real science from pseudoscience, according to the experimental method. But if you are incapable of presenting an experiment to prove or disprove the existence of a purpose for any entity, then this, from the experimental science's point of view, makes such things as purpose and design pseudosciences. This is the argument that the scientific community resorts to as a reason for rejecting the theory of intelligent design and accepting the theory of evolution. However, this argument is completely invalid, because if we apply it to the Mona Lisa example above, we would be incapable of presenting an experiment to prove that the Mona Lisa is better than the random colorful drawings, and the scientific judgment will be that whoever claims that it's better has presented a pseudo-scientific judgment. In the same way, the theory of intelligent design was, and still is, considered pseudoscience. But we all know that there is something wrong with this concept. And this is what is meant when I said that restricting knowledge to such a narrow perception is a big mistake, because otherwise science becomes only whatever that you can prove by presenting empirical and testable predictions, meaning that only empirical evidence would confirm or disprove a theoretical hypothesis, and anything that cannot be tested experimentally becomes pseudoscience, a myth, or at best, a relative concept that has no absolute truth in it. This is doing injustice to empirical science by forcing it into areas inappropriate for its use, and using its authority to oppose the human intellect and the truth. By shoving truths into a narrow frame like this, even though we know that for certain there are truths that are outside that frame, and that making it the reference to judge these areas of knowledge produces totally wrong results. The fact that there are things that cannot be proven experimentally totally refutes this concept and shows its inadequacy to accommodate all kinds of truths. Therefore, we should give up the business of generalization and the claim that anything that cannot be proven through experiments, also known as scientism, is a myth or pseudoscience. To be more precise, we say that the scientific experimental method should only be applied to natural phenomenons, and that it would be meaningless to apply it to abstract objects, because the evidence to an abstract object should be of the same nature, i.e., a logical evidence, just like the evidence for a natural phenomenon should be the same kind, a physical and testable evidence. Mathematics is the perfect example to demonstrate the inadequacy of experimental science to explain all kinds of facts. This is because mathematics are truths, but according to the positive experimental concept, it cannot exactly be considered science, because it doesn't offer testable predictions that can be experimentally verified, especially pure mathematics, which, unlike applied mathematics, inclines toward generality and deals with totalities. Pure mathematics are independent of the physical world. They depend only on logical evidence, which makes it the perfect example for our subject. This is why the famous British mathematician J.H. Hardy said that a mathematician, like a painter or poet, is a maker of patterns. If his patterns are more permanent than theirs, it is because they are made with ideas. The dilemma here is that we can't but consider mathematical theorems as established facts. Example, the Pythagorean theorem, even though they aren't subject to empirical verification and cannot produce an experimental evidence to support it. And this is because of the independence of mathematics from the physical reality. So whether it's a mathematical hypothesis or a conjecture, practical evidence cannot be considered as evidence, even if we use supercomputers that can solve millions of complex equations in a matter of seconds. Because even if you do 1 billion experiments, you can't guarantee that the next billion experiments will produce the same results. For example, Collat's conjecture, including the Collat's fractal, was checked by supercomputers for values up to 2.88 times 10 to the 18th power. Are these experiments considered an experimental evidence that proves this mathematical hypothesis? The answer is no. because you can't guarantee that the result will be infinitely true, as mistakes could begin to show if the numbers are too big, as happened with both mathematical conjectures, Polya conjecture, Skew's number, and Merton's conjecture. The last one, the Merton's conjecture, stays true until it reaches the value 1.004 times 10 to the 33rd power, which is a massive number, of course. This inductive problem, which took mathematics outside the realm of the scientific experimental method, applies to the experimental method itself, if you want to prove its own validity as a method. Because the experimental method then will face a big problem, which is what David Hume called the problem of induction, which means that the experimental method itself cannot be proven experimentally. This is because we don't have evidence to prove that our past inductive conclusions for phenomena will stay true in the future, except through the same inductive method that we applied in the past, which creates a vicious cycle and a circular argument, which is when the thing that we want to prove is also the very thing that we use in order to prove it, or for it to be a cause for itself. This undoubtedly also proves the inadequacy of the experimental method to accommodate all kinds of facts. I would like to conclude with a simple example, a self-evident fact, such as the fact that if two things are complete opposites to each other, they cannot exist together, or the fact that an object cannot be a square and a circle at the same level, and at the same time. Such facts like these cannot be proven by experimental method, because if you search the entire universe looking for that squared circle, and you couldn't find it, then it could be in some nearby universe, which would require an eternity to search for it. But we know with logical evidence that this description, circle, contradicts the other description, square, so it's meaningless to combine. The evidence for a belief in a creator is mostly inferential and logical. Design, purpose, and casualty, meaning they are abstract things that can be dealt with by using one's mind and intellect, as they don't have physical existence. The evidence of casualty, for example, is not concerned with the nature of characteristics of things, but it's an abstract thought that's concerned with the governing relationships between things or meanings, regardless of the characteristics of these things or meanings. And this is a mathematical logical relationship in the first place. This is why the problem of appealing to empirical science to explain and prove everything must be resolved first before getting involved in any debate between religious thought and materialist thought. Because the inadequacy of empirical science to deal with some abstract facts can be misused to discredit all logical facts and abstract values, and make it seem as though empirical science had presented the evidence that there are no truths except the truths that are within its grip and that are subject to its terms, while in reality, empirical science fails to recognize the truths that don't yield to its terms and cannot be dealt with empirically. And the difference between the ability to present a proof and the inability to comprehend something is the difference between truth and falsehood. And it's the difference between the claim that empirical science supports atheism, while in reality exploiting the existing insufficiency of empirical science to deal with all the facts of life in order to support atheism. That is why when getting into a debate with an atheist, I almost always start by saying, I will prove to you that a creator exists using the same proof that you will use to prove that you are a sane person. Because even though we both know that he or she is sane, and they know what kind of thought they are thinking at this moment, or a minute ago, they are of course incapable of proving such things empirically. They can only know these things logically, as a person knows the difference between abstract truths like sanity and insanity, truth and falsehood, by detecting and observing the effects of these traits on the doer. So if they can realize that saying or putting the right words in the right place is evidence for wisdom and intellect, and can use that to prove that they have a sound mind, then they are depending on a logical evidence, purpose, and they don't depend upon empirical evidence to prove that. If they don't doubt that the evidence they depended on is true, in spite of the lack of empirical evidence in this case, then they can see without a doubt that empirical science is not the only means to acquire truths. And they can see clearly, without a doubt, that the lack of empirical evidence to prove that something is true is not an evidence against it. And this prepares the ground for beginning the debate. But if they doubt their own sanity, then the debate is over before it begins. The difference between the attitude of an agnostic and that of a seeker of the existence of a creator. A believer claims that they have evidence to prove their case, and an atheist claims that they went through this evidence and found it to be untrue, while an agnostic claims that there can be no definite evidence to either prove or disprove this issue. These are three claims, and everyone is required to present the evidence for what they believe in. One could think of an agnostic's attitude as like that of a seeker. They both are searching for the truth, but it should be known that an agnostic has already formed an opinion, a rigid claim that this matter cannot be proved or disproved, just like the famous Bertrand Russell's flying teapot that keeps on revolving about the sun between Earth and Mars, and no telescope can see it. This is an example that Russell gave to depict a case which no one can either prove or disprove, and so it stays a matter of personal preference or a hypothesis. But for this matter to become a subject for dispute between people to divide themselves into believers and disbelievers is considered criminal and crazy, according to Russell. We might agree with Russell's teapot, but the claim that the existence of evidence for belief in a creator is just as fictional as the teapot is a superficial claim and a form of blindness. The agnostic claims that the nature of evidence and the methodology used by the believer are defective in the first place. Therefore, they are unworthy of serious discussion. Thus, an agnostic can be considered an atheist who lost their enthusiasm. This attitude is completely different from the attitude of a seeker. It could even be the total opposite. A seeker doesn't have an opinion about this matter just yet, as they still think that truth must lie somewhere, unlike a believer or an atheist, whose very descriptions indicate their positive stances and the final judgment. A seeker shares the opinion with both the believer and the atheist that truth can be attained, except that to them the problem is still unsolved yet, but they don't have anything in common with the agnostic. If a seeker is now standing on the beginning of a path that diverges into two other paths, at the end of which stands the believer and the atheist, and you look for the agnostic, you won't find them. They might be in a nearby city. We conclude then that there is a big difference between an agnostic and a truth seeker, and that a believer, an atheist, and an agnostic, they all have a special claim. Therefore, each are required to prove their claim. To say that the believer is the only one who has a claim, and that the burden of proof lies with them is completely erroneous. Is believing in the Creator an appeal to ignorance or for the God of the gaps? The objective of atheists is to prove that the universe and living beings don't need a creator in order for them to exist, and that the laws of physics are in themselves enough for giving existence to the universe with all its complex mechanisms, big or minute, and are enough to explain everything, and that biological laws, genetics, mutations, and natural selection, etc., are enough to create and sustain living beings, and enough to explain their existence and diversity. On the other hand, our objective, we believers, is to present sufficient evidence to prove that this universe must have a creator, and cannot be independent with its existence and laws. There are laws that govern it, yes, but they can't bring it into being, like atheists imagine. We know that the laws of physics and biology are principles which God made as causes to sustain the universe. Of this we have no doubt, and there is nothing in it that contradicts Islam, as Islam always states that Allah, be He exalted and praised, affect things with their causes. But we know for certain that it's possible for these causes to be independent by themselves, and they can't possibly by themselves present a sufficient explanation for the existence of the universe or living beings. We don't deny the material causes that Allah put in the universe. Neither mind or Islamic laws approve of denying those causes. And giving birth is a result of marriage, and faith and good deeds are a reason to obtain Allah's approval, etc. And at the same time, the reason for our belief in God is not because we are ignorant or incapable of explaining some of those causes of natural phenomena, and thus we considered our lack of knowledge and evidence for His existence. And this is what is called God of the gaps, or appeal to mystery fallacy, but rather we know that cosmic events can't cause themselves. And we know that this vast and diverse kingdom of living beings can't have been caused by blind, natural mechanisms. And there are many other evidence for the existence of a creator which we know. Our evidence, therefore, is based on knowledge and not on lack of knowledge, as atheists claim. You could say that the truth is entirely the opposite of this claim. Because while the God of the gaps theory is based on an apparent presence of missing links between cause and effect in some of the natural phenomena, that causes to think that the phenomena has no cause, which leads to the assumption that since we don't know its cause, then its cause must be supernatural. Its cause must be God. While this is what the theory means, we say that the intactness of the law of causality and its governance for everything in the universe is our evidence for the existence of Allah, be He exalted and praised. As the more we get to know about a phenomenon and its causes and the principles that govern it, the more confident we are in our evidence for the existence of a creator. And every cause unknown to those who worship the God of the gaps increase their faith in their God. There exists a huge difference between the two evidences and the two methods. And if some believers do fall in some of these fallacies, therefore refusing the existence of some or all laws and natural mechanisms in order to completely shut the door in the face of atheists' claims, they are mistaken. Because the existence of the laws which God uses to sustain the universe and everything in it is deeply rooted in our Islamic faith. And because if we would like to successfully refute pure materialist thought, we do that by showing that those laws and causes are incapable of presenting a complete and valid explanation for the phenomena of life and the existence of the universe, not by refusing the existence of those laws. For example, the sun exists, and it's the source of energy on the planets of the solar system. Suppose we observe the existence of nuclear reactors on planet Pluto, and someone came to claim that it is the solar energy that created those reactors, because the solar energy is generated from nuclear fusion. And since the sun is the source of energy on planet Pluto, then it is the direct reason for the existence of the nuclear reactors. Therefore, no creator is needed. If someone came along to say this to us, we would admit that yes, there is no sufficient reason for the phenomenon. Would we say that the sun doesn't exist? Of course not. There are those who misunderstand the law of cause and effect, who think that when God says that He created something, then this means there is no need for a material cause. Truth is, when God attributes the existence of things to His creative powers, the objective here is not to deny the law of cause and effect, but to remind people that He is the one who creates and guides these things, and that if He didn't exist, there wouldn't exist anything, and that He is the source of all bounties and good things. This is not to deny the causes He created for these things to exist, because it's of God's wisdom that He created this law. Whomever claims that the evidence for the existence of God is that this or that thing doesn't have a cause to affect its existence, then they don't know what Islam is. The principles of Sunni Islam, which some innovative cults differ with, that proving those causes is an important Islamic principle. For example, we prove that fire burns, but at the same time we don't see fire as an independent cause for burning, as God is able to cancel out its ability to burn if He wills. Ibn al-Qayyim, a prominent Islamic scholar, said, commenting on this issue, "It is a great injustice to divine laws and prophethood and monotheism to delude people by trying to convince them that in order to not set partners with Allah, then they must deny the existence of causes. If rational people think that this is a requirement to prove that there is only one God, be He exalted, then this is an awful thing to say about faith and the messengers. You can never find a book like Quran to prove the existence of causes more vehemently. Even the miracles of the prophets that don't adhere to the laws and principles that God put in the universe, God made them happen with causes, in accordance with the holistic principle in religion. When God wanted to part the seas for Moses, for example, He ordered him to strike the sea with his staff, making this a cause for parting the sea. Allah said, "Then we inspired to Moses, strike with your staff the sea, and it parted, and each portion was like a great towering mountain." Surah Ash-Shu'ara 63. And when He wanted to open water streams for Israelites, He ordered him to strike the stones with his staff. Allah said, and recall when Moses prayed for water for his people. So we said, strike with your staff the stone, and there gushed forth from it 12 springs, and every people knew its watering place. Eat and drink from the provision of Allah, and do not commit abuse on the earth, spreading corruption. Surah Al-Baqarah 60. And when he wanted to make Prophet Muhammad victorious over his enemies during the battle of Badr, he ordered him to throw sand onto the army of the polytheists, as Allah said, "And you did not kill them, but it was Allah who killed them. And you threw not, O Muhammad, when you threw, but it was Allah who threw that he might test the believers with a good test. And indeed Allah is hearing and knowing." Surah Al-Anfal 17. And when he wanted to give Maryam from his bounties, when she was very weak and tired after she gave birth to Jesus, he ordered her to shake the palm tree, which cannot be shaken by 12 strong men. Allah said, "And shake towards you the trunk of the palm tree. It will drop on you fresh ripe dates." Surah Maryam 25. All these are miracles, and they all happened outside the realm of cosmic laws, and were all done with causes, even though those causes can never affect such events. But this happened in consideration to this great principle.